Hello, my name's Ken Gibb. I work at the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence and at the University of Glasgow. I'm going to have a conversation today with Alex Marsh, who's also from CASH and at the University of Bristol, about what we make of some of the highlights, I guess, of the New Deal for Tenants, which is the Scottish Government's renter strategy consultation, which is the subject of the conference. So this is a really comprehensive document. The first thing you are struck by when you look at it is the size of it. It's a long document. It covers a wide range of housing issues, and there are more than 60 consultation questions to respond to. And I think the consultation closing date is the middle of April. So there are plenty of time for people to respond to it. And I think maybe like ourselves in the Collaborative Centre, we are probably going to respond to some, though not all, of the issues. So what Alex and I are going to do today is we are going to alight on 3 or 4 issues and talk about them in a bit more detail, just really as a taster for the wide-ranging subject matter that is there.
Yes, thanks, Ken. So coming to the consultation sort of slightly at one remove and having a look at it, I mean, there's lots of really interesting things in there from the detail to the very broad brush and sort of setting out a vision. So I thought maybe there are 3 or 4 things that struck me as interesting we might explore. The first one is the strategy is very upfront about the right to adequate housing, connecting to international debates about sort of framing housing provision. And I'd just be interested in your thoughts about that as the sort of benchmark or the jumping off point for the strategy.
Well, that's right. There's been a lot of interest in this really since, particularly an escalated level of interest over the last year or 18 months. So regardless, I think, of how one thinks about the place of natural rights or human rights, this is something that's happening. And I think everybody in the housing sector has to kind of get on board and recognize that there's really significant changes ahead that have to be dealt with. So we just last week launched a report produced by the Chartered Institute of Housing and written by Gillian Young about the ways in which a right to adequate housing has direct impacts on housing providers and what they have to do. And it's really a checklist of the range of things that have to be considered. And it's a really excellent, as you say, stepping off point to think about these things. So Gillian also wrote a piece last year for Alacho, which was about what she called a can opener kind of paper. It was about trying to think about the challenges and issues both for government and for housing providers about actually enabling and carrying out what this adequate housing right would mean. So I think what's interesting is that the UN and the government, and as they say in this consultation document, recognise that there are at least 7 dimensions to what adequate housing actually means, like affordability, accessibility, location, cultural adequacy, etc. And all of these things have to be measured, monitored. The threshold or the requirement needs to be understood, and there needs to be clearly capacity to manage and deal with these issues. And in the discussions we've been having, 3 or 4 issues keep coming up. One of them is how, particularly in the light of this consultation, how do we properly engage with the private rented sector, the atomistic private rented sector with tens of thousands of private landlords in Scotland? How do we fully engage with them and their tenants? How do we get the data in order to measure and understand these things? And I think what the broader policy understanding is that there needs to be essentially a progressive realization over time of achieving the right in a comprehensive way. And that's about what they call the core minimum obligations. And that kind of subset of these dimensions of adequate housing, we need to find a way of understanding what that core minimum obligation set is. I think that's for government to do, as I understand it. And that in itself is quite a big task. So there's a huge amount of work, it seems to me, to push forward this. But as you said right at the beginning, this is really the cornerstone of where all this discussion about equalising the position of tenants is really coming from, I guess.
Yes, and I think one of the fascinating things about putting it up front as a sort of laying down a marker for the sort of longer term vision for housing is once the data of the type you describe is assembled and sort of measured against, where are, I mean, I always think the right to adequate housing, I mean, at one level, it sounds like it sets the threshold low, but actually it's a significant challenge across the dimensions, looking at where the housing stock is at present and how far you need to travel, not just existing providers as you refer, but what's not there at all at the moment to get to the point where you know that right is realized is going to be a significant long-term journey.
That's right. And actually in Gillian's earlier piece, which was very much concerned with about how you would kind of score your path along the trajectory, she pointed to one issue in particular, which is about energy efficiency and net zero and thinking of social tenants, thinking about the standard that is now under dispute in Scotland, being reviewed, EIS 2, which is essentially getting to EPC-B for all social tenants. And so you're kind of thinking, well, is achieving that standard part of the core obligations, and how challenging is that, and how can that be achieved? And now, of course, you know, we're actually actively reviewing what that standard ought to be, as well as the actual kind of methodology that it sits within, whether, you know, that the SAP ratings are the right way to go, and a lot of people don't think they are, etc. So just in that very one small area, it's a very important area, you know, there's a real challenge there, I think.
Absolutely. So that's the first sort of big chunky topic that appears in the document, and I think we've raised a number of points there that I'll just quickly summarize on this slide. Okay, so the second topic that I picked out, which is one which I know that we've been thinking about a little bit already, is rent control. So we've got again a clear statement of intent, a national system to be in place in the next few years, by 2025. So your reflections on where the consultation paper takes that conversation.
Well, it is a consultation paper. It is going to be trying to assemble a lot of information and views from different stakeholders, different perspectives, and we know that there are very strongly contested views about the principle, let alone what actually might be being suggested. I think there's a number of things to say. One is that the statement about rent controls remains very high level and abstract. It could encompass a whole number of things. There is absolutely no commitment in the document that I could see between later generation rent controls and earlier ones about whether they're focusing on rent increases or on the initial rent and all of those sorts of things. What's different, I think, about the document here is that there's a real commitment to a functioning, there's a vision of the private rented sector about trying to deliver rent controls which do not impact, or I think the phrase they use is do not compromise the quality of the offer, of the outcomes, and that low-income rental affordability is protected, but that it will not, you know, diminish the supply of good quality rental market housing. So that's a lot more than was kind of what was in the original SNP Green Statement, I think. So that I think is quite helpful. And this kind of vision of what a well-functioning private rented sector would be is a bit of a step forward. They also say that the policy will be evidenced, and you know, Cash has had discussions with government about that because of the evidence review that we've been doing and related things. But I think it's still extremely open as to where they might go, and I presume there'll be a series of other conversations. I mean, one other conversation that's happening just now is the Scottish Cross-Party Group on Housing has a working group on rent control, and it's a similar kind of exercise in a sense, and it has a very different set of stakeholders, and Cash is involved in that, and hopefully we'll be able to publish some of the outcomes from that over the next 6 or 8 weeks.
One of the things that I guess comes through from the evidence is such as it is around the world is the stage, moving beyond the current stage to the detail is really important for how, you know, for achieving some of those objectives. You know, that the rent controls are all about patterns of incentives to the different actors within the market, and it's quite easy to get it wrong, and careful design though can mitigate some of those risks, and if you're going down that route, attending to some of those sort of very detailed questions of designing particular mechanisms, is going to be really, really, really important. But I guess in that context, like my observation was, the evidence will only get you so far, in the sense that you can look at how it works in other contexts, in other times, in other sort of institutional sort of matrices for the housing market, and that will give you some insight. But there is an element of novelty and innovation in moving into a mechanism into a new housing market context, and that's sort of inevitable, and there's an irreducible level of innovation required, because the evidence isn't going to give you the answer with absolute clarity.
Yeah, that's right. I think actually that there's a number of ways in which commentators can contribute to this. There is this thing about marshalling the evidence, identifying the gaps, trying to say what works and what doesn't work, and the context that happens in. But there's also a kind of, trying to enable a degree of analysis of what's being proposed. So we don't really know what's being proposed, but I guess what I'm saying is, when government is trying to work out the shape and the margins of what that policy is, that they should be thinking about the system-wide effects, the secondary effects, and how that plays out. So for instance, something we've talked about before is actually, if landlords are deterred by a rent control, what do they actually do? It's one thing to say that, well, they'll reduce supply, but what does that actually mean? Are they just going to sit on vacant properties? Are they going to sell properties into own and occupation, or probably to the highest bidder, actually, one would imagine? But will that actually be out of rental housing, or will it be to another private landlord? It's not really clear. One of the things we know insufficiently about is how landlords behave when they exit, and what choices that they actually make. So I think any policy like this, which is designed to impact on how the market works, needs to think quite hard about how those things might work in practice.
Absolutely. So we've got some interesting future discussions to have, and we'll just summarize where we've got to on this slide. Our third topic, which we'll just reflect on, is again a potentially chunky intervention in the private rented sector, and that is the proposal to not so much expand the remit of existing regulators, but to establish a new private rented sector regulator. And I would just be interested in your reflections on that as an idea.
I think at one level, it makes some kind of sense that here is a large, diverse sector where the overarching strategy is trying to raise the standards of the sector, the experience and the rights of the tenants involved. So having some overarching regulatory process and kind of agency makes some sense at some level. But I think the current statement in the consultation is very abstract and very high level, and it's quite hard to really work out what this thing would look like at this stage. And I guess they're punting for advice. They're trying to find out what kind of things they might do. But I keep going back to the thought of that sense that somewhere like Glasgow has in excess of 30,000 private landlords, and a very atomized kind of structure. And how would a regulator engage with that? There is a sense at the moment that I think a lot of traditional buy-to-let landlords are disengaged from the policy discussion and the process. And in very small ways, we're having these reforms around internal linked smoke alarms and such like that. That's to be in every household. And how engaged are they with that? How engaged are they with the energy efficiency processes coming down the track? Some of them don't seem to be, and they seem to respond and react very, very late in the day. So how is the regulator going to work? How is it going to complement what the social housing regulator does? Where does it begin and end? And really importantly, I think, how is its work to try to bring this regulatory framework for private renting together? How is that enforced and made compliant? And to what extent does it sit with what local government does? And all of those things are really unclear at this stage, I think. So it's not obvious to me at this stage what that organisation, what that private regulator will look like as an organisation, what its purpose is and what its role is, and how it does the business. So it does seem very early in the discussion at this point.
And you flagged up, so I guess you flagged up some issues which face every regulator in every sector about engaging, and particularly engaging with some of the perhaps the more marginal or peripheral, or maybe those that are operating in ways which are closer to the edge of the sort of acceptable behavior, for example, in terms of quality and standards and of management, etc. Quite often those are the ones that are most disengaged. But I think that challenge it faces sort of all industries, but private renting, you're right, the fragmentation, of it, and also the fluidity of people moving in and out of, not just tenants but landlords moving in and out of the sector, sort of, just engaging, the challenge of engaging, the challenge of getting providers to realize they need to engage with the framework. I mean, is one that's been around for a long time, but this brings it into really sharp focus. If this is going to be an effective vehicle, an organization for sort of driving standards and improvements, and then it sort of throws those sort of challenges into stark relief. I guess the interesting challenge is thinking about ways to make it sort of integral to the everyday running of the sector, so it's not something that sits off at the side and therefore landlords can miss it, if you see what I mean. It's like, how do you place its activities and its interconnections with the life of the sector in such a way that landlords will know about it. I mean, they might choose not to engage, but it's not inadvertent. In that case, they're going to know what's happening, and they know it's there, and they know they should. And the question then is, in terms of the culture of the sector, and lots of landlords no doubt then will, but how do you ensure that is sort of a broad-based engagement if it's going to be effective as a mechanism?
Yes, and I suppose the broader debate and the things that we've been involved in about raising standards of the private rented sector is the adverse selection problem. That there are landlords who it seems to be easier to communicate with, who are more involved in their associations and such like. They're not the problem. It's how you deal with these harder to reach groups, and does a single entity of a regulator for the whole of the country, does that offer an opportunity to really get at that? And it probably does, if it has the scale and the capacity and the resource and ways in which it can use the law and regulatory powers. Then I can see why that's attractive, but that's one thing. It's like the aim's attractive, the vision's quite attractive, but how we do it and what it looks like just isn't clear yet.
And there's a big data question in there, but I got a feeling we've probably outstayed our welcome in terms of time. So maybe we'll leave that to others to explore. So here's a slide that just captures some of those thoughts about the regulator. And I think we should draw our time to a close. So that seems to me to be kicking off a conversation. There's a huge document with plenty more to say. Some of it is rummaging in the detail of proposals. Some of it is sort of sketching out what the detail might look like. So there's got to be some broad-ranging and productive conversations to be had, and it feels like from the document that the government is open to that conversation and looking for stakeholders to input. And obviously today's conference is part of that conversation, and I'm sure colleagues who are at the conference will want to add their contributions and their initial thoughts in a conversation which is going to evolve over the next couple of months.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Alex.
Cheers.